Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you at long last.
Yep, we've been traveling in similar circles for a long time, but we've never met.
Yeah, which I find a little bit odd, actually.
It is odd.
I wonder, first of all, how are things going over there? You're in Portland, is that right?
I am in Portland, yes, here in Oregon. And yeah, things are not going well in Portland on a number of different fronts. At the moment, the air is tremendously toxic, and the political environment isn't much better.
Yeah, I think that your air quality over there is equally as bad to ours here in Vancouver. If not even a little bit better. For a while there, we were the second worst in the world as far as air quality goes.
Yes, I believe we attained worst in the world status.
Oh, okay. Well, you win.
I guess so. I can't say that makes me very happy, but yeah, that did occur.
No, it's awful. And what's going on in terms of protests, rioting, things like that? Is that still pretty intense over there these days?
It certainly was at the point that the smoke descended. My sense is that even the protesters and rioters have been discouraged by the smoke, and that we are in a lull. The question is what happens when the smoke lifts, and I don't think any of us know, probably not even the protesters.
So I want to get into BLM and the protests at some point, but I first want to talk to you about Unity 2020. Maybe you can just explain what Unity 2020 is to start.
Sure. So in the U.S., we have a first-past-the-post system for our elections that results in two gigantic, incoherent parties that rule our political lives. And this duopoly has become deeply corrupt. And unfortunately, it's impossible to challenge it through any normal mechanism, because if one attempts to, let's say, advance a third-party ticket, one is always challenged with the argument that whatever values it is that you imbue that third party with, you will draw votes away from whichever of the major parties is closer to that perspective and thereby empower the greater evil. And so this greater evil, lesser evil paradox prevents us from ever escaping from the hegemony of the duopoly. And Unity 2020 is a proposal to beat that argument by removing ideology from the question entirely. So the plan is to draft two candidates, one from the left and one from the right, under the agreement that they will govern together by consensus. And the person who will be at the top of the ticket will be chosen by a coin flip. After 4 years, their positions will reverse. Whoever had been president will run for the vice presidential slot. And this will continue until one party has inhabited the presidency twice, and then they would be replaced in this team by somebody who was eligible to be elected. So that's the proposal, and the idea is that because this is non-ideological and because it brings left and right together in a consensus government, it does not tend to empower one party as it disempowers the other. It disempowers both major parties and brings together patriots in the interest of governing the nation.
I think this sounds like a great idea. What kind of feedback have you received or support?
Well, we receive a lot of feedback. Some of it is completely preposterous. We are still accused of empowering the greater evil, though nobody seems quite certain which side that would be. But we have actually gotten a tremendous amount of encouragement from people who recognize that this actually has to happen. Something has to break the stranglehold of the duopoly. And so even many of our critics say it's a great idea. They are doubtful that it can happen in 2020, but they are looking forward to seeing the unity movement grow over time.
So do you think that you all are a little late for the 2020 possibility, or do you think that's still a possibility for you?
Well, let's put it this way. We are certainly late, and that is the result of the fact that our national emergency became clear at the point that the two parties had each nominated an unacceptable candidate for president. So we're late by virtue of the fact that the thing that calls us to action was also late in the game. And of course, the duopoly depends on the fact that it has created onerous rules to prevent anybody from producing a credible option that they don't control. That said, we have two septuagenarians running for office, and neither of them is a popular choice. Both of them are polarizing, and there is much doubt and uncertainty about what will take place between now and Election Day. And I will say that although the path to office grows more difficult as things like ballots are printed that contain particular names and not others, it is not impossible that this plan could work until right up until virtually Election Day. So there are ways it can function. Is it a long shot? Of course it's a long shot. On the other hand, the circumstances are quite shocking, and the necessity to do something that breaks the dynamic is clear. So, there's no telling. It's 2020.
Yeah, it is. Apparently there's nothing that cannot happen this year. What candidates are you looking at?
Well, we went through an extensive nomination process. That nomination process revealed 6 candidates who, just by happenstance, happened to be 3 on the left and 3 on the right. We ran a ranked choice vote, which I think is quite an accomplishment, and it produced our top ticket, which is Tulsi Gabbard and Dan Crenshaw.
Oh, okay. Interesting. What happened to Andrew Yang? I saw you doing an interview talking about Yang.
Yep, Yang and Admiral William McRaven ended up as the second most favored ticket.
Oh, okay. I'm a big Yang fan, so that's why I ask.
I am as well.
I think it was in that same interview that I watched. I can't remember who it was with, unfortunately. But you identified yourself as, you said you're not a centrist, but you're a radical. And I was just wondering what that meant. What does it mean to be a radical? I mean, the word radical, I think, is very confusing to people because they just associate it with extremist.
Yes, well, let's put it this way. I'm a reluctant radical. I don't want to be a radical. Radical change is dangerous, and I wouldn't entertain advocating radical change if I didn't think it was necessary to our survival. But I do. I think we have come to a point where, as beautiful as the Constitution is, it is no longer fully adequate to deal with the problems of the 21st century that the founders were, by no fault of their own, unable to envision. So what I believe is that we need an update to our system, that any major change carries with it risks, and that one of the things that liberals frequently get wrong is they have positive intentions and they don't anticipate the consequences of their solution making. So as I would like to think, enlightened liberal, I would say we have to be very cognizant of the danger of the solutions that we deploy. And, to the extent that I would argue that we need radical change, we should go into it with our eyes open, cognizant of all of the things that we've accomplished that we should be very careful not to disrupt.
I know that recently the Unity 2020 Twitter account was suspended. When did that happen?
Yes, that is true. And actually, when it was suspended, I thought of you because, of course, you were thrown off of Twitter under similarly absurd circumstances some years ago. So yes, we were shut down at Twitter. They have not responded to our appeal. They have shown us no evidence whatsoever. They have back channel accused us of registering something like 50 accounts for the purpose of amplifying a hashtag. We did an internal investigation. There's no truth in this allegation. But, as you discovered yourself, if Twitter decides that you are an unacceptable person, then that simply means you have to go elsewhere. And that's where we are. But the larger point, I think, is, in your case, it threw you off Twitter, my understanding is it did so for saying things that are A, true, B, obvious, and C, sayable by some people, but apparently not by others. So, maybe I can say that men and women are different phenomena by virtue of being a biologist, but you, being a woman, don't have that same license, I guess. Well, in any case, what I wanted to say was that in our case, we are a grassroots effort. We are staffed entirely by volunteers, including me, and we are very interested in dislodging the duopoly that has corrupted the American political system. For Twitter to throw us off, and mind you, it went actually much farther than they're just shutting down our official account. They also blocked anyone on Twitter from linking our website. If you attempted to link the website in which we described our plan for challenging the duopoly, you got a warning back that the website was thought to contain harmful information, and you were unable to post your tweet. So they did eventually reverse that. I think that was a little bit too obvious, that claiming that the website that anybody could go to and see did not contain dangerous information or wrong information or anything of the sort. That was embarrassing to them, and so they reversed course. But when it comes to the behavior of our official account, of course, nobody's in a position to check. When I log into that account, even I can't see, the direct messages or anything else. The account is simply frozen.
I mean, this is insane. Like, why did they target your account? Why did they target Unity 2020?
Well, allow me to speculate. Twitter is a major economic player, and it is getting its needs served in our political process through corruption, largely of the Democratic Party. So it is loath to give up its special access, especially in favor of citizens who want government to work in their interests, and so it has engaged in sabotage. Now, I don't believe that it knows that. I'm sure internally it rationalizes that it is doing something noble. Unless I miss my guess, it would be telling itself a story about the necessity of shutting down Unity 2020 so as to prevent Donald Trump from being reelected. Of course, the irony is that this egregious behavior is likely to reelect Donald Trump because people are sick and tired of these sorts of shenanigans, and they see Trump as a strong figure in opposing them, never mind whether that's actually right or not. But nonetheless, they have taken a political position against a non-ideological, apolitical, patriotic entity, and in so doing, they have revealed where their sympathies lie.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I find this whole situation with Twitter odd. Like, I still haven't even really been able to figure out why I was banned permanently because, I mean, as you say, I mean, I said things that were pretty basic. I didn't break any Twitter rules. I was saying obvious things that everyone knows and asking questions and making statements that other people have made many times on Twitter and not been banned. And I mean, I sort of wonder what the goal is there. I mean, Twitter, obviously, their primary goal is to profit. So we as users generate revenue for Twitter, essentially. So I don't actually know how it benefits the company financially to go around banning people like me or Unity 2020 or the others that they've permanently suspended for ideological or political reasons.
Well, I think your case and mine are a little different here. In the case of Unity 2020, there is, I think, clearly a political agenda, and that political agenda is to maintain the special access that Twitter and other Silicon Valley Goliaths have within the Democratic Party. In other words, they don't want a fair electoral system, and that does profit the company. They are, for example, positioned to get the benefits of both being a platform, which is not responsible for the content that is found on their site, and a publisher which can go around arbitrarily banning people as a matter of self-protection. And so, it would like to maintain that position and not have any obligations that come with it, and arguably that's in their interest. I also think, though, that there is another phenomenon afoot, which is that just like every other institution, Twitter is made up of people, and many of those people are young and have sympathies with the woke movement that is toppling one institution after another. And so it is entirely likely that one of the things that has taken place at Twitter is that internal pressures have been brought to bear. And, it's hard to say what the top people at Twitter actually understand about what took place. We know that our antagonists reported us falsely. They accused us of being Russian bots, for example. And so undoubtedly a coordinated set of reports from users, which we know took place because they bragged about it, that triggered some kind of internal review that was ripe for abuse. And how, this obviously is not a workable mechanism. It's too open to being manipulated by people with an agenda. But nonetheless, it is consistent with their interest in maintaining their access to the governance structure that they would want to protect the duopoly from those that legitimately challenge it. It is also true that Kamala Harris's former press secretary is highly placed at Twitter in their communications division. And so what may have taken place behind the scenes, we can't say. But in your case, what you said, which as I recall it was something to the effect of, but men aren't women. Is that correct?
Yeah, they shut down my account for saying men aren't women, and then for asking what the difference is between a man and a trans woman. And I wasn't being antagonistic in asking that question. That's a question that I ask quite often when I'm, talking about gender identity ideology, because I'm trying to force people to come up with some coherent responses and definitions. So I'm saying, what happens in that process? Like, there's a man here, there's a trans woman here. How are we defining, where's the line? What's the difference? What's happening in between? And then the final thing that they actually, so they shut down my account and made me delete those tweets, which I did. And then I referred to Yaniv, who was that man who dragged a bunch of local estheticians here in Vancouver to the Human Rights Tribunal because they wouldn't give him a Brazilian bikini wax. I referred to him as he. I said, and again, not in an antagonistic way, I just said, yeah, it's him. And that's what I was permanently banned for. And I don't even know why still. They said, hateful conduct, but they didn't actually tell me what rule I broke. I'm guessing it was misgendering, but I actually don't know that. They accused me on Rogan of harassing. They said, "Oh, well, she was breaking rules for a long time, and she was warned for breaking rules," which wasn't true. They accused me of harassing trans people, which has never been true. I just, I'd never engaged in anything that could possibly be construed as harassment or hateful conduct or any of those things. So I don't even know if Jack Dorsey knows why I was banned, to be honest. He may have been lying, or he may have just been guessing and talking out of his ass, or saying something that he was told by others at the company and said, oh yeah, Meghan's terrible. She goes around harassing trans people all the time, But yeah, my best guess is misgendering, but
well, that's certainly how it looked from the outside. And as for what Jack does or doesn't know, it's anybody's guess. But I will say, to the extent that anything at all was revealed about our case by what Jack said to my brother, who he was in contact with, it bore no resemblance to reality. And it took us a week to make sure that that was the case. Because we have a large number of volunteers, we needed to make sure that there wasn't something we were unaware of. But even having put in that effort and, more than willing to share that report with Twitter, they've just gone silent on us. And I think the longer that goes on, the clearer it becomes that this was a political move, either by something within Twitter or by Twitter itself. Either way, it's completely unacceptable.
Yeah, I mean, I find it so disturbing because social media obviously is having such a massive impact on politics and, is playing a really large role, as many perceive it, in creating polarization and division. And, I would argue that it had a large role in the Black Lives Matter. I mean, the way that debate plays out online, our conversations around race and racism, and same with the gender identity thing. I mean, I kind of honestly feel that gender identity ideology wouldn't have really taken off in the way that it has if not for this warped perception and warped messaging on social media in terms of what is true, what is a fact, what's acceptable to say and not to say, what one should believe and repeat as a progressive. I mean, it's shaping culture in a major way.
Yeah, and this is one of the places that I think the Constitution, as wonderful an attempt as it is inadequate, is that we need to have a public square. And when the public square was an actual place, it didn't take sides. And what we have now is a de facto public square with a private on-ramp, and it has a very definite political perspective. Not only that, but it's got perverse incentives. And we simply can't have that because the entire basis on which democracy would function is the ability of citizens to talk to each other. And you can't do that in an environment that decides some positions can't be voiced because somebody is sensitive to them. In order for speech rights to carry the value that they once carried, they have to be protected where it is that we actually talk to each other.
Yeah, totally. And not only that, but I think that it's teaching people what their politics are and should be. Like, I think that a lot of people online are repeating, ideologies and political positions and mantras and taking sides because they're seeing, oh, everyone else in my bubble here, everyone else on my feed is saying these things. I guess this is what I'm supposed to say. And they're not seeing opposing views, or at least they're not seeing opposing views being portrayed in a reasonable way. This is, that polarization thing. It's like, oh, well, everyone good says and thinks this. Everyone good is, posting a black square or saying trans women are women or whatever it is. There's a million other kinds of issues like this, but those are probably some of the more prominent ones. And, in terms of the debates and cultural conversation these days. And so I think people are kind of being tricked into believing what's right, what's wrong, like what they're allowed to question, what kinds of language they're able to use based on what social media has fed to them.
Well, I think it might even be worse than that. If we take your case, a person that wished to remain on Twitter for whatever reason, for social reasons, because it was essential to their earning or whatever it was, might reasonably deduce from what happened to you that a perspective that they actually believed, that men and women are two different phenomena and they can be distinguished objectively, which is of course true, is not a perspective that one should voice, which will then give the impression to anybody who is in doubt about this that this is a much more difficult question than it actually is. In other words, they will see a deficit of people speaking the obvious truth that men and women are different, and they will infer from it that maybe this is some sort of social construct. And so they are creating a world that leaves a false impression, and then that false impression will be used as evidence that there is more doubt than there actually is.
Mm-hmm. I mean, which is interesting because like some social media companies have moved towards banning fake news, essentially. Like Facebook will put warnings over content posted by people that, and when they've deemed this, sketchy information, I suppose you could say. And meanwhile, they're at the same time kind of perpetuating fake news themselves.
Oh, absolutely. And the fact is, you cannot navigate this way. So if you take the issue of what is the origin of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, there is every reason to doubt the story of a natural origin, which doesn't mean it didn't occur naturally, but it means that many people who have the proper training to interpret this do not believe the story that it is likely a natural virus that escaped into the human population. There is a small but dedicated group of people researching this in the lab and discovering that the more we dig, the less likely that explanation becomes. And because this issue, which shouldn't be political at all, has been politicized, these platforms have taken a position on it that effectively those who doubt the official story are, conspiracy theorists, as if that term meant anything, when in fact what they are is honest brokers trying to navigate a question in which the evidence simply does not point where the official story suggests.
Interesting. I wonder, in terms of all this censorship and shaping of politics and ideology and everything, in terms of what social media is doing, and especially in terms of the fact that they're not accountable. They're so high on their power. They're so entitled. They don't actually believe that they have to be accountable to anyone. They don't believe they have to be accountable to users, to governments. They position themselves as a private company, like we're a private company, we can make decisions about who's allowed to use our platform. But clearly everyone knows, including them, that this is much more than just a private company. It's not just a tool that we can all choose to use or not use. What do we have any recourse? I mean, what can we be doing?
Well, the irony is that we do have recourse, but it involves functional governance. And in the U.S., at least, our functional governance is so compromised by corruption that, in fact, it has been established with a rigorous scientific procedure that the public's will has almost no influence over policy. And so, the remedy here is fairly obvious. It is for us to establish our rights and to have them codified in law, and for that to protect everyone equally on these platforms. And unfortunately, the very system that Twitter is protecting is the one that prevents us from doing the obviously right thing that would leave us free to speak and interact and disagree honorably the way the founders of the U.S. and therefore the founders of much of the Western structure intended.
I'm curious to know if you think that social media has, or maybe to what extent social media has played a role in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the protests, in the vitriol and the polarization that's happening right now around the topic of race and racism in the U.S.
Yeah, of course it has. I think it's, at the very least, it is an amplifier of the division that we have naturally, and it has resulted in the ability of very fringe ideological perspectives to take hold by virtue of the fact that they can be deployed in a weaponized form. So, if you take Black Lives Matter itself, I can't speak for anyone else, but I would say the idea of Black Lives Matter is one that resonates with me. I believe Black lives are undervalued in the U.S., and that's a problem that needs a remedy. Now, I believe it's a problem we've made great progress on, but I don't think the job is done. And so if you just ask me, do Black Lives matter? The answer is yes, of course. On the other hand, if you ask me, do I support Black Lives Matter? The answer has to be no, because Black Lives Matter is an organization, and that organization advocates things that I think are incredibly foolish and things that I believe will actually harm black people. So Black Lives Matter is a kind of Rorschach test, right? Are we talking about the concept, or are we talking about the organization? And the fact that the two things are named in the same way means that anybody who's asked about this is automatically in a very tricky situation. So the discovery that construction, that placing odious things in a box labeled with something intuitively positive, that works, is a trick that can spread online and does spread online. And so part of what we're up against is that this movement, which makes very foolish claims, has a strategy that is very sophisticated. And it's sophisticated because largely it was allowed to evolve in these online environments where people could try out different formulations and see which ones stuck.
And in terms of the foolish claims, so the claims that Black Lives Matter is making, or, what Black Lives Matter is demanding, what are we talking about here?
Well, the most obvious of them is the idea that the nuclear family is somehow a construction of Europeans, that it is being imposed on other people as an oppressive measure, and that we need to somehow challenge the nuclear family, which is nonsense. Unfortunately, I would argue that the brutal nature of our economic system in the U.S., the destruction of the safety net, the failure to equalize the opportunities that populations have had in the aftermath of things like Jim Crow, that those things have left some populations, in particular blacks, in a disadvantaged position in society, that this has a large, if not total, influence on the disproportionate likelihood of crime occurring in black communities, the disproportionate interaction with the police, the disproportionate likelihood of black males to end up in our prison system, and the removal of black males from communities through this process has disadvantaged women in the mating and dating market, not to put too fine a point on it. So in an environment where males have been eliminated by whatever mechanism, females are in a disadvantaged position. They have a much harder time getting men to commit to them because those men are in high demand. And so that tragic situation has a profound influence on a system that perpetuates disadvantage. Now, if you tell me that the solution to this is to destroy the nuclear family, I think exactly the opposite is true. The problem is the nuclear family has already been crippled in the black community by the uneven sex ratio. And so the right move would be to figure out how to adjust things such that women's bargaining position was restored. So Black Lives Matter is proposing a solution that is upside down. But virtually no one realizes that, because when they hear Black Lives Matter, most people don't even realize that they are taking a position on, the viability and importance of the nuclear family. In fact, I believe that although this was prominently on their website some months ago, that the pushback they got from a small number of us resulted in them eliminating that. Now, they never repudiated their position, as far as I know, but they did take a very aggressive stance against the nuclear family, and now it is no longer on their website. So those of us who point to it are left in the odd situation of having to use things like the Wayback Machine to establish that it ever existed.
Interesting. I mean, I was not aware of that. And I mean, another idea or demand that's being pushed by Black Lives Matter, of course, is the defund or abolish the police position, which I find insane. And
I think you're being kind.
yeah, like I mean, it's frustrating because as somebody who's like run in like leftist and feminist circles for some time now, I'll hear and see repeated over and over again from other feminists, we have to support Black Lives Matter. Like, as a feminist, you have to support Black Lives Matter because, you know, racism impacts women too, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't really support Black Lives Matter. As you say, like, of course, I think that there is still a problem with racism in the US that's quite complex. And, like, I support the idea that Black Lives Matter, of course, but in as far as what that organization stands for and what it means when you say Black Lives Matter, you know, what that is attached to in terms of ideology and politics, including the fact that this movement is supportive of gender identity ideology and, you know, the idea that trans women are women and so on and so forth, which are ideas that I disagree with. And I don't support the idea of abolishing the police at all. So no, I don't support Black Lives Matter. And the response will be, oh, well, then clearly you're a racist, like you're doing white feminism. And it's really difficult to have these conversations. I mean, I think feminists particularly should be understanding and wary of the idea of abolishing the police, because I don't know who we're supposed to go to in that case as women in situations of domestic violence, for example, or sexual assault.
No, the idea of defunding the police is beyond insane. Now, there is a problem with policing. I'm convinced of this. But the idea that it is a simple matter of too much funding is the height of nonsense. And there is not a community in the U.S. that will be made safer for Black people by eliminating the police. Quite the opposite. It will be an invitation to all sorts of crime. And as you point out, this will not only make Black people generally vulnerable, but it will make women of every color vulnerable. It's an insane idea. And it's the sort of thing that tells you that the people who are writing the script of this movement are either disingenuous and dangerous on that basis, or so severely misinformed about how things actually function that they couldn't possibly be trusted to advise society on how to improve things. They just simply don't understand, right? And it doesn't mean that the policing is equally good in all communities. It doesn't mean that police brutality doesn't fall more heavily on one community than another, but the idea that that the police are so bad that no police would be better, no, there's no community for which that's correct.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, can you talk a bit about what's been going on in Portland in terms of these protests? There's, I've seen a lot of footage online. I've read a lot in the news about what's been going on. But then there's also people who will say, this is being overblown. The media is like picking and choosing what they show. And in fact, the protests are mostly peaceful and there isn't all this destruction going on and looting and whatever. I mean, what have you seen? What's going on?
Well, I don't think this is that complex. It's become complex because you have two entities pushing false stories on two different sides. But where the truth falls out is pretty clear, and you don't have to be in Portland to see it. The truth is, there has been, and as I said up top, I think this may have been suspended a bit while we've been suffering such terrible air quality, but there was something like 100 consecutive days of protests. And protest isn't really the right word, because although it was a small group of people, it was a very dedicated group of people that engaged in violence each and every night. So the key thing to understand is that although there were periods of time that you could show up and see a protest that was not violent, those people were choosing to show up at a protest that they knew would become violent, right? This was an absolutely reliable pattern. And that violence included open threats of murder against the police. It included grisly symbolic acts like the decapitation of a pig and the burning of its head with a police hat on it in the center of Portland. It involved the declaring of an autonomous zone, which of course led to lawlessness. It has led to repeated acts of arson, fire in the streets. Fires have been lit inside of buildings. The mayor himself had a fire lit in the lobby of his building, a building that contained other families. I mean, this is just jaw-dropping stuff. Now, is Portland on fire? No, that's never been the case. It has been a small number of blocks. At first, it was the space in front of the Hatfield courthouse. Then it became a mobile nightly riot in which rioters used online resources to coordinate which neighborhood they were going to invade and which buildings they were going to attack. But there is a clearly violent riot by dressing itself up as a racial justice move or movement. It has protected itself because the mayor and the governor are terrified of being seen as opposing such a thing. But in any case, Portland is mostly not affected, but this is clearly a coordinated effort. It is clearly about anarchism rather than about race. In other words, there's been a long-standing anarchist movement in the Pacific Northwest, stretching back at least to the WTO protests, and that movement has simply glommed on to the Black Lives Matter movement as a way of cloaking itself. So I don't think this is that complex, but if you are looking for evidence that the protests are nonviolent, well, I can tell you what time of day to show up, and you can see a nonviolent protest if that's what you want. If you're looking to see violence, then you have to wait till later in the night, and you can see a nightly standoff between police and rioters. And to me, what that says is you've got reliable violence that is not being challenged by the authorities that have an obligation to solve the issue.
Mm-hmm. I've been trying to figure out, I mean, so there's a few places that seem to share woke politics, you could say. Seattle, Portland, Vancouver. Vancouver is much less volatile than Seattle and Portland. I mean, we don't have the same history in politics that America does, so it wouldn't make sense for there to be Black Lives Matter riots here, or even protests, I would argue, although there were some marches here that were just really marches. I mean, I thought it was sort of silly because we were sort of glomming onto an American context that doesn't really exist here, but whatever. But, you know, like last week, I don't know if you heard about this. Actually, a friend of mine, one of the women who's organized some of the events around gender identity here in Vancouver, Amy Ham, put up a billboard here in Vancouver that said, "I heart J.K. Rowling." And I'm sure you followed the controversy around J.K. Rowling and what she's been writing and tweeting in terms of her concerns about the impact of gender identity ideology on women. In any case, there was a media backlash. You know, all the Vancouver anarchists, the leftists, trans activists, whatever you want to call it, demanded the billboard be taken down. A city councilor demanded the billboard be taken down, and so it was the very next day. And there was like an extreme level of vitriol, threats, harassment directed at Amy, and it's so extreme, and it's also so accepted. You know, there's a certain kind of politicking that's allowed in these kinds of places, and I've been struggling to figure out why. Like, I've been struggling to figure out why these kinds of politics in particular have become so enmeshed in Seattle, in Portland, in Vancouver, to the point that, you know, you're not allowed to question any of the accepted narratives or mantras or ideologies. I don't know if you have any ideas.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know the answer. I've wondered about it myself, and it may just be happenstance. You know, it may be that because it caught on here for reasons that may be arbitrary, that it's where people with those sympathies tend to gravitate, and it doesn't take a very substantial concentration before you get a positive feedback. With respect to Vancouver being a place where Black Lives Matter protests or riots would be out of place. I agree with you. Canada is a different place with a different history. On the other hand, we've seen protests in Europe in places that are also quite different from the U.S., as if it's all one environment. And so that tells us something, that in fact what we're really seeing is online culture sort of spilling over into the real world. And so it could well happen in Vancouver. As for the fact of these trans activists, it's a very difficult puzzle, because I'm sure you will have found yourself in the same position where one wants to be supportive of trans people. That does not mean that there's no distinction between trans people and those of the sexes into which they aspire. And it certainly doesn't mean that there is nobody abusing the cloak of transness in order to engage in all sorts of onerous behavior, right? So, you raised the case of Yaniv or Jonathan. Now, this seems to be somebody who is delighting in using the double protection of the category trans woman in order to push all sorts of systems around, including the legal system, right? So, the fact is, woman is a protected category because women have a biological disadvantage when it comes to strength, right? That's a simple fact. So the idea that you can opt into the category woman is itself absurd, especially at the level of legal protections. And that is a threat to people who are born female. But the idea that trans is also a category that deserves protection and that you can opt into means that people who wish to do harm can get 2 points in their favor simply by claiming to have this gender identity. And how do we protect those who are dysphoric, find themselves transitioning because it feels more natural to them, who are deserving of protection? How do we protect them while challenging those who would use these categories illegitimately to defend their malevolent behavior?
I know you're probably sick of talking about Evergreen at this point, but I sort of feel like obligated to talk to you about it. When did that happen? What year was that?
2017. It happened May 23rd at just before 10 o'clock in the morning. That's when it started.
Okay. It seems like a really long time ago.
It does. It seems like roughly a lifetime ago, or maybe two.
So when that went down in 2017, had you kind of seen all this coming? I mean, I don't know what you would call it. Cancel culture, I guess, would be an easy way to label it.
Well, it's like this. So the protests that erupted at my classroom just before 10 in the morning on Tuesday, May 23rd, 2017, happened 1 year to the day after I stood up in a faculty meeting where there were no students present and opposed an onerous policy proposal. Now, it was my job to do it. But nonetheless, I'm pretty sure that what happened was payback and that it came from the faculty. And I was aware at the point I stood up. In fact, I spoke. As I stood up, I said, I've never been afraid to speak in front of this faculty before, but I have the sense that what I'm about to say is going to put me at risk, and it did. So yes, I saw it coming, but not early enough, right? Now, I've been fighting against postmodernism since the 90s when I was a college student. It's not like the hazard of postmodernism was new to me, but the new version of it, the highly racialized version that comes out of critical race theory, was new. And because Heather and I had a very enriching teaching life, that is to say, we had a community of students that were very dedicated to learning from us about evolution. I don't know how much you know about Evergreen, but Evergreen was a very unusual place in the sense that professors taught one class at a time, full-time. Students took one class at a time, full-time, and those classes could go on for a full year. So we knew our students really well. Students would typically bounce from my programs to Heather's programs to the programs that we taught together. And this resulted in us having a very lively group of students that we really liked and cared about and invested in, and that insulated us to a certain extent from what was going on elsewhere in the college. And we knew when we interacted with other faculty members that things were not healthy, but, we could ignore it. And my sense is we were probably living on borrowed time for a couple of years. And, the clock started ticking in earnest in 2016 when I stood up and challenged my faculty colleagues about what they were up to. And then it broke out into the public in May of 2017. So yes, I wish I had understood earlier what was headed our way, but I did know for a full year that it was coming.
Mm-hmm. And what was it specifically that you were opposing, just for clarity's sake?
Sure. It was a proposal that the faculty were advancing that we negotiate into our contract an obligation each and every year to reflect in a public document on our progress relative to our own racism. So the fact that we have our own racism was assumed, and the idea that all of us should expound on it annually to see how much progress we had made seemed the height of insanity to me. For one thing, it seemed like these documents, our self-evaluations, are fodder for hiring, firing, promotion, these sorts of things. So it immediately puts everyone in a predicament, which is if you are assumed to have racism and you are asked every year how much progress did you make and of what form, then if you say, well, actually, I don't think I do, I'm not racist, then you have left yourself vulnerable to those who would challenge you and say, not only are you racist, because we know you are, but you're also lacking self-awareness, right? Or you're exhibiting white fragility or whatever it is that's going to be leveled. And so you're clearly not fit to remain on the faculty or to get tenure or whatever it might be. So I challenged this because, if they had asked, for example, for us to reflect on our understanding of race annually in a private document, I still would have thought that was wrong, but it wouldn't have been so serious. But what they were doing was providing themselves the tool to restructure the faculty around racial lines. And that to me was absolutely abhorrent and at a public institution, completely unacceptable.
And so a year later, when things blew up, how did it feel to be on the other end of that, and on the other end of those, the students holding you hostage and things like that?
Well, different than you would imagine, because what isn't obvious unless you know the players is that I didn't know any of the students who were leveling these accusations, and all of my students remained loyal. So in some ways, as tragic as what unfolded at Evergreen was, it was very heartening to watch all of the people who actually knew me, at least at the student level, stand by me, some of them quite courageously. I had several students of color who insisted on going with me to the meetings where protesters were lambasting the administrators, the chief of police, and me. These students thought I wasn't safe to go alone, and they went with me and they spoke on my behalf. So, I have to feel pretty good about that. I don't feel good about what happened at Evergreen, but, if you think, you've surely seen the video of me being challenged outside my classroom. That challenge, I should tell you, I think it was the day before, I had actually put on the board a model of how witch hunts unfold, because what I was seeing on the faculty side was so clear, and it was so relevant to the class I was teaching that I shared with them what I was thinking. And in any case, when it unfolded at my class and these students that I had not met challenged me, my feeling was it happens that the life I have led is inconsistent with the accusation that they're leveling, and I can endure this because it's not going to stick. And the odd thing was it didn't stick with anybody who was actually interested in looking at the evidence, but there were a lot of people who were clearly not. And so it polarized. And what really caught me off guard was that although I was a popular professor and I had tenure, and my wife was the most popular professor at Evergreen and she had tenure, that in effect, this movement did have the power to drive us out because they had the administration on their side.
Mm-hmm. And actually, I'm just realizing I don't actually know how you were driven out. Did you resign or?
Yeah, we were effectively forced to. So what happened was, what erupted at my classroom on May 23rd was a protest. It very quickly devolved over the course of the next day into riots. There were kidnappings, including kidnappings of the president of the college and administrators. The president of the college instructed the police, the campus police, not to enforce the law. They literally locked themselves inside their police station. They called me up to tell me they couldn't protect me, that I was being hunted as far as they could tell, and that they couldn't protect me and that I should be very careful because they didn't know what would happen if the rioters caught up to me. So that created a very dangerous environment. And we ended up, for reasons that aren't worth going into, the state of Washington requires you to give the state 60 days notice before you're going to sue them. So you have to file a document that tells the state what you're going to sue them for before you do. So we never actually got to the point of suing them because the college negotiated with us before we actually filed our lawsuit. But in the end, we were left with a situation where in order to fight that lawsuit, we would either have to resign and fight the lawsuit without any income or other resolution, go back to work in an environment where our boss, the president of the college, had clearly shown a willingness to let us be physically endangered by a violent movement that believed that we were demons, or we could settle with the college and move on. And so we settled with the college and moved on. But they forced us out. Yes, we resigned, but there was no good way to go back to teaching, and the college made it very clear that they weren't going to remedy any of the things that made the campus unsafe. In fact, they blamed us for what happened, and they effectively mocked us by offering their remedy was that they would give us panic buttons so that if we were panicked, we could press these buttons, and I don't know what was supposed to happen then, but as if the problem had something to do with our being jittery rather than them having allowed an armed mob of students to police the campus.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the lack of institutional support for people who get attacked in this way, I find so appalling. And I mean, and this has happened to me in a smaller context. Like I think back in 2015 or something like that, I was working for a left-wing publication in Canada, and there was a big online effort that lasted months to try to get me fired. There was a big, huge petition that was signed by all these mostly Toronto activists, but, people across Canada to try to get me fired, accusing me of all sorts of silly things like racism and whorephobia and...
Wait, what phobia?
Whorephobia. So this was mostly attached to, at the time, my work mostly focused on the issue of prostitution. So I argue against the system of prostitution, and I argue for a particular legal model called the Nordic model, which criminalizes pimps, johns, and brothel owners and decriminalizes people in prostitution, which is a very controversial thing for whatever reason. But in any case, and the activists who support the full legalization of prostitution will accuse those who oppose the system of prostitution on the basis that it's, dangerous and harmful and abusive and exploitative, of being whorephobic. So it's sort of similar to the transphobia. It's similar to all of the phobia accusations, where if you put forward a critique You're just accused of hating people or fearing people. It's twisted into an attack on individuals or marginalized groups rather than a critique of, an ideology or a law or a system or a policy or something like that.
Well, I would imagine that if you have a phobia and you leave it untreated, it could develop into an ism.
Okay, elaborate on that.
I'm just making stuff up because that's what they do, and I'm trying to figure out how it works. So I don't know. Would a phobia become an ism? It could, I guess, but yeah.
Beware.
Beware, exactly.
Okay, I get it. But in any case, it didn't work because the publication that I worked for, just part-time, it was just like a small editing position. They didn't have any reason to fire me, of course, because I hadn't actually done or said anything wrong or offensive, but they punished me internally by, refusing to speak to me ever again. Like my colleagues or whatever wouldn't talk to me, and they all blamed me for the situation. So what I'm getting at in this like long-winded story is that the institutions will most often blame the victim of the attack because, they don't want to or feel unable to stand up to the people who are harassing them and making demands on them. And so you become the problematic figure. You're causing trouble, and you should just kind of like be nice and sit down and shut up and not make things so hard for everyone.
Well, you should know this is the model I put on the board the day before the protests erupted at my classroom. Basically, the idea was there are a tiny number of people who will initiate a witch hunt. There are a small but substantial number of people who will participate in a witch hunt. There are a large number of people who will say nothing, and there are a tiny number of people who will resist, and those are the witches. Right? Yeah. So you were a designated witch. I've been a designated witch. And, overall, one of the lessons that I learned was that there's just an absolute epidemic of cowardice. And what you're describing are institutions that have an obligation to protect people who are wrongly accused, but they don't have the courage to do it. And, if we could cure the epidemic of cowardice, we'd be in a very different place. But I must say I'm not hopeful.
I'm not hopeful either. And I can't accept it. I wish that I sort of could accept that so many people are cowardly, but I can't because I don't understand it and I don't relate to it, and it makes me mad because the problem, like you say, it's a minority of people who will sort of advance these ideas or claims and attack people in this way. And the major problem is that most people just won't stand up. It's a minority of people versus a majority of people who just don't want to rock the boat. And if those people did stand up, then this wouldn't be the issue that it is.
Oh, yeah. And the people who don't stand up, it's going to come for them. In fact, even the people who are pushing this movement, when the movement wins, if that's what happens, it's going to be unstable. And all of the constituent parts of it are going to battle each other for, who's king of the raft. And it just won't last. But nonetheless, people don't see this. They see their immediate incentives. They see their fears about what happens if they don't say the right thing right this instant, and so they say the wrong thing, and then from there it's a slippery slope. They actually will convince themselves that they believe it.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to switch gears a little bit because I feel I want to talk to you a bit about feminism. So, you're an evolutionary biologist. I wonder, this is a big question. I wonder what you believe to be the biggest mistakes that feminism has made.
Well, I think it depends what feminism we're talking about. I must tell you, there was a time in my life where I would have called myself a feminist. It's been a long time because my sense is that the modern incarnation of feminism is so confused that I want no part of it. I feel a little bit about it the way I do about Black Lives Matter, which is in principle, to the extent that feminism is about equal opportunity for women, I'm totally on board. And in fact, I'm enthusiastic in the following sense. I don't know how much you know about Heather and how much you followed her, but Heather is, she was very much a tomboy when she was a kid, and she grew into a woman who doesn't adhere to any of the traditional kinds of limits that women of prior generations adhered to. And I think it's great. I'm thrilled to have a partner to go adventuring with, and somebody who, takes risk in a way that might more traditionally have been associated with a man. That's great. And I would say that I think we are due for a renegotiation of the deal between the sexes, because the deal is just simply out of date, right? It's time to reopen it. However, that doesn't mean that men and women are the same phenomenon, and we have to leave open the possibility that even if the opportunities are equalized, that preferences will differ. And at some level, the most important thing is we have to realize that these differences, even if they're not desirable in the modern context, or at least some of them aren't, are rooted in biology. Even the parts that are transmitted culturally and that are not genetic, they evolved culturally for a reason. They fit a past environment. And so what I would like to see is an enlightened feminism that does seek to provide opportunity where that opportunity has been missing, but also understands that the expectation should not be that men and women will behave the same way, and that that's not desirable. That in fact, the relationship between male and female has been a yin-yang relationship, and that that's actually a dynamic structure. And seeking sameness is naive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. And I think, it's tough because there are different versions of feminism. And there's, most feminists that I know and have worked with would disagree with much of what's happening in mainstream feminism or popular feminism, third wave feminism, whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, like I've noticed in all iterations of feminism, there is an overemphasis, I would say, on socialization, and an underemphasis or skepticism of the evolutionary perspective, and the idea that any aspects of gender could be, I don't know, let's say natural, inherent, biological.
Yeah, well, this is crazy, of course, because it's fair to turn the question around. If it were the case that differences in gender roles were not the result of evolution, how the heck would that have come to be, right? Now, of course, my point would be, if you look across, for example, cultures, there's no culture in which it is traditional for women to engage in warfare. Warfare is the province of men. That is not the result of oppression. It is intimately related with the process that has created a differential in strength, in height, in bone density, and all sorts of things between males and females. And to imagine that the cultural aspects of that are arbitrary is preposterous. Of course this has a basis, and the basis is pretty obvious. The fact is, men are more expendable. From the point of view of your population making it into the future and enduring, men can at some rate be lost in conflict, whereas women, because of their obligations in child rearing, which are asymmetrical, are a much more valuable resource, and it is much more important that that they be protected from what takes place on a battlefield. So let's just take that as one example of a place where an asymmetry is clearly the result of a biological bias that is easy to understand. And then let's just say there are many other places where the logic may be different and more subtle, but it is equally robust. The truth is, the evolutionary nature of male and female is pretty easy to understand, and it's much less fraught than, let's say, race relations. Now, I believe there's a biological story to be told there too, but it's more difficult and more controversial. But when it comes to why male and female differ, in what ways they differ, this isn't a human story. It has a human chapter, but the fact is the distinction between male and female goes back hundreds of millions of years, and there is enough diversity for us to understand what parameters affect which other ones. This is a biological question, and we may not like the answer. We may even say that answer doesn't suit us anymore. Let's change it. But to pretend it isn't biology is really to put one's head in the sand.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I believe that there is obviously a mix of, evolution and socialization and cultural norms that shapes our understanding of gender roles, that shapes our understanding of masculinity and femininity, that shapes our behaviors and choices. Obviously, I don't know how to weight those sides at all. I don't know if anyone does. Do you?
Well, I would say the question of how to weight them already puts us at a disadvantage with respect to understanding them, because what people don't get is that culture is just as biological as genes. And so to say, that there's, what we shouldn't say is that there's a biological component to gender and there's a cultural component, because the cultural component is biological as well. These are two different modes of inheritance, but they are both shaped by evolution in slightly different ways, but not radically different ways. And they both serve the same objective, which is the long-term persistence of the lineages. So to my way of thinking, yes, it is an interesting question at one level, but it's an academic question. Which of these things are transmitted genetically, which of them are transmitted culturally, and which of them are transmitted as a mixture? But it's not a question you have to answer in terms of knowing what role evolution is playing. Evolution built us to succeed. It didn't build us to be happy. It didn't build us to be equitable. It built us to make it into the future. Now, we may value things like being happy and being equitable, and we may choose to change these roles in the interest of doing that better, which I think is actually a desirable thing to do. But we shouldn't pretend that these patterns didn't emerge in the context of evolution with an understandable objective. They did. Well, all I'm saying is that this is an evolutionary landscape, whether we like it or not. And that's a different question as to whether or not we should change the relationship between male and female going forward. But invalidating what we understand about the evolutionary nature of male and female in order to change it is a non sequitur. We don't need to pretend that this is non-evolutionary in order to demand change. The fact is, the biological asymmetries in reproduction have been unfair to women. That's just simply true. So should we seek to change the relationship so that women have equal opportunity? Of course. I think that goes without saying. But it doesn't mean, the patriarchy did not inflict internal gestation on women. Right? What inflicted internal gestation on women were reproductive considerations in which that was the best way to nourish and protect a very tiny offspring.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, one of my frustrations around, this debate around what's natural and what's not natural is, that I guess, no matter how much you can argue that something is natural, it doesn't mean that it's inherently neutral or good. But also, I find that a lot of people will defend things like objectification, sexualization, and that extends into things like pornography, prostitution, and that's sort of been primarily a thing that I've challenged in my work, this naturalization of objectification and what happens when you objectify another human being, which, objectification can happen in different ways to different people, and, to animals and things like that. But, if you objectify somebody, you dehumanize them, and I believe that to be dangerous. And so whether or not there is some kind of evolutionary root, or, you know, whether or not it's natural for men to objectify women, I don't really know. But the extent to which it happens today, you know, online and in pornography, in advertising, whatever, does, to my mind, reinforce sexist treatment of women. Let's say that.
100%. But, you know, let me put this in terms that I think will make it really clear. Genocide is natural. We should absolutely do everything in our power to prevent it. Is the objectification of women a good thing? No, it's a terrible thing. Is it natural? Well, it's built of natural stuff, at least. Doesn't mean we have to do it, right? Murder is natural, theft is natural, all sorts of terrible things are natural. And the beauty of civilization is that we get to refactor these things to make them less common. You don't want to walk down the street and be vulnerable to every person who's capable of overpowering you. That's a terrible situation to live in. So what do? Well, we pay a tax to create a force that can protect you from those who would attempt to overpower you, and we make rules about how they are to behave, and then we hold them to account in a court. These are all perfectly excellent ways of adjusting the way we interact with each other so as to shift the balance of all of these natural forces. And I'm not shy about saying we should do it. Of course we should do it. But, you know, am I going to pretend, for example, that rape isn't an evolutionary phenomenon? I mean, of course it is, and obviously so.
I'm wondering how, I often find myself sort of frustrated or in conflict with sex researchers in particular, because I feel that we have like a different idea of what sex and gender means, and that, you know, actually a lot of sex researchers will just use the terms interchangeably, which is what everyone out in the outside world also does. And then I'm, you know, always frustrated by it because I feel like I keep correcting them and they don't listen. But I wonder, how would you define gender versus sex? And what do you mean when you say masculine and feminine?
So Heather and I were talking about this topic on our last Dark Horse podcast. And we realized that we actually define this slightly differently from each other. And, you know, because we speak the same evolutionary language, it's pretty easy to interconvert between them. What I would say is that gender is the software of sex, right? That these are both evolved phenomena, but that the software layer is more plastic. It can be changed. The hardware layer, the genetically encoded layer, is much more difficult to change. But nonetheless, that's one interpretation. And Heather's alternative involves regarding gender as the behavioral component of sex. And the way these things differ is that some of the behavioral component could be genetically encoded. Some of it would be learned culturally. Some of it might be genetically encoded. So anyway, you can pick one or the other of those. I think they're both quite defensible. What is not the case in either of these rubrics is that gender is arbitrary, whether it's the behavioral aspect or that which is transmitted culturally. It is still an adaptation to a set of evolutionary concerns. And that doesn't mean that those concerns still exist, right? So, for example, a major concern for a female ancestor would have been the accumulation of sufficient food resources in order to bring a child to term and then to raise it to viability. Food calories are not an issue anymore. In fact, the opposite is an issue. It's easy to accumulate too many food calories. So the fact that we may be predisposed to accumulate those calories in one way or another, and that may create health hazards, it's a biological fact. But in the modern era, we should change behavior and change incentives so that we pick up the proper programming so that it doesn't become a hazard. And it's like everything else. Our novel environment alters how well suited we are, but it doesn't change how we got this way.
So would you argue that there are only two options for gender?
No, but definitely not. I would argue that there are some constraints, but I would argue that there's tremendous diversity in the way we deal with gender in different cultures. And in fact, you'll find in many cultures, maybe even all of them, that there is an allowance for people whose gender is intermediate. And I'm not talking about intersex. I'm talking about actual people whose gender is non-standard. That's a very typical thing for a culture to make allowances for. Now, of course, modifying your body surgically, taking hormones and puberty blockers and things, those are modern interventions that don't have a long history. But the very fact of people expressing gender differently, of women who are very masculine, for example, that is a feature of the landscape. And frankly, I think it provides advantages to populations that have it.
Right. I will let you escape soon. I'm taking up a lot of your time. Thanks. I appreciate it, by the way.
No, I'm having a great time.
Okay, good. Me too. I'm wondering where, to move back to the question of cancel culture, I'm wondering where you think cancel culture comes from. I mean, I almost feel bad because I've become so critical of feminism, and I've always been critical of the left, and it's sort of like, I think people are like, why don't you criticize our enemies more, which I do, like whoever you want to consider your enemy, but it's because that's what I'm familiar with, and it's so therefore, and it's also like what I'm most disappointed by, because I was so gung-ho that the left is right and the right is wrong, and that's sort of how I saw the world. There's like our side, and then there's everybody else who's wrong and bad, and they just don't get it. And if I just keep explaining to them what I think, then they'll get it. And same thing with feminism. And at a certain point, my analysis developed further, and I started paying more attention to people who were looking at things in a different way, which I highly recommend to everyone. But I'm frustrated because the feminists that I know, however you want to define them, I don't think they're all radical feminists. Some would probably call themselves gender critical feminists. They're people who would be critical of third wave feminism, of trans activism, of popular feminism, or some of them would call it liberal feminism. As much as they're critical of cancel culture when it happens to them, so in terms of shutting down the debate around gender identity, I see those same people participating in cancel culture when it's about something that challenges their mantras or ideologies, or what they believe, or what they believe is right and good and ethical. And I find it really frustrating. And I don't understand the hypocrisy. Like, I don't understand the inability or unwillingness to see that you're engaging in the same behavior that you're critical of, or maybe you do see it, but you'll argue that it's okay because, it's the argument around free speech, right? I'm an advocate for free speech for everyone, no matter what they're saying, unless they're threatening overt violence or genocide. But like, it's free speech for us, but not for them. And the argument in feminism is that, well, it's because our speech is feminist speech, and therefore it's good and ethical speech, and this is bad and dangerous speech. And of course, I'm always like, well, who gets to decide? Like, why do you get to decide what's right and what's wrong? And why do you think that anybody is going to defend this position? Like, most people in the world are not going to be like, okay, let's put the radical feminists in charge. Like, I wouldn't do that. So, like, I don't know if you have any ideas around why, where's the missing chip there?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. You started by asking where it came from, and I think actually I have a pretty good sense of the answer to that question, and I think it may address the rest of what you were saying. So,
Yeah, sorry, I went off on a whole other tangent and then changed my question by the end of it, but thank you
no,
for bringing us back.
I resonate with it, and in fact, I've been through the very same thing you have. So, where cancel culture came from. I'm going to steel man it. And I'm going to say that I believe that there's a context in which it is absolutely the right behavior. And that context, if you imagine an online discussion forum, let's say that I had a discussion forum of evolutionary biologists. And let's say that a creationist came in there, right? Or imagine you could do the same thing with geologists or astronomers or whatever, You have a discussion that you want to hold about some topic, and you have people who are hostile to you on the basis that even your assumptions are at odds with their worldview. Do I have to surrender every evolutionary conversation to those who wish to claim that evolution never happened, or am I allowed to have a conversation in which the evolutionists and those who are willing to listen to them have a conversation? Surely the answer is I'm allowed to have an evolutionary conversation. I don't have to shut it down just because somebody has a difference of opinion. So if I have my evolutionary discussion online and somebody comes in and they start spouting creationism every time somebody makes a point, we effectively have a right to shut down their ability to interact in that conversation, right? There's no other authority. So it's the only mechanism by which we can have the conversation. If I have a right to talk about evolution with other evolutionists, then I apparently have the right to shut somebody who doesn't believe in evolution out of the conversation. Now, does that mean that evolutionists in general have the right never to entertain a critique of evolutionary thinking? Of course not. Darwin could be wrong. We have to leave that possibility open. But every conversation about evolution doesn't devolve into that. We have to be able to discuss more interesting topics. So these small communities self-police by shutting down those who are hostile to the discussion that they want to have. Now the problem is, if you take that same modality and you scale it up to Twitter, or you scale it up to civilization, then what you do have is those who are willing to wield stigma able to shut down the speech of others. So the behavior that makes sense in a tiny group is abhorrent when it takes place in the wider context, and it is especially dangerous when it moves out into the physical world. So that said, I'm not a fan of the idea. Cancel culture is not a term I like because I think what we are dealing with is much more dangerous than that. It's sort of has a trivial connotation. Sorry. Yeah, the air here is not high quality. But in any case, I think we have an obligation to try to figure out which perspectives are legitimate and relevant, even if they're ones we don't want to hear, and we should err in the direction of allowing people to speak, even in a context of evolution, for example. There are young Earth creationists who have nothing useful to say on the topic, and there are some other people who are skeptical of Darwin who have very interesting challenges to level, and we should err in the direction of letting them air those things rather than just shutting down their perspective because it's possible in some context. But in general, one would want a system in which the rules of a venue were clear. They were clear as you came through the door. There was a process by which somebody who violated the rules might be removed from the discussion. There was an appeals process so that it wasn't ripe for abuse. And we don't have this. So what we effectively have are ideological mobs using stigma to shape conversation, which then goes on to shape thought. And that's just a very dangerous situation.
Mm-hmm. And what would you call, I mean, I would agree with you that cancel culture just sounds kind of trivial and doesn't really encompass all that's going on. How would you describe what's going on?
Yeah, I'm not fond of the term cancel culture. It suggests a trivial phenomenon that essentially it's about hurting people's feelings or something like that. And what we really have is a horizontal revolution in which power is deployed inside of an institution, and it actually results in people who are being, quote unquote, canceled, losing their livelihood, their ability to earn, their security. And these are very serious material matters. So I think it is far better for us to think of this as a horizontal revolution in which these institutions are taken over and effectively captured by a movement that is wielding stigma in a game theoretically powerful way. We've all seen it. You have experienced it. Your banishment from Twitter was the result of pressure being brought to bear that caused you to be driven out for saying things that were certainly well within the bounds of reasonable opinion.
Yeah. And I mean, there's been a lot of kind of think pieces, and, people have tweeted similar things, insisting that cancel culture doesn't actually exist, that it's just about, I don't know, holding people accountable for what they say. So people will say, sure, you can have free speech, but you're not free from the consequences. How would you respond to those people?
Well, that's nonsense. The fact is, we're talking about a systematic effort to deprive people of equal access. It's one thing to disagree with somebody and to level your counter argument. Of course, you and I would both be fine with that. The problem is that the purpose here is not actually to level a counter argument at all. It's to punish somebody for saying something with two purposes. One, to prevent them from having access to the places where they might say these things and have an impact. And two, to send a warning to others who might dare think the same things, that they should probably be quiet about them. So the ultimate purpose is really to drive opinions that are legitimate out of the landscape so that it appears that they are fringe.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's what people really miss, whether intentionally or not, when they say things like that, or yeah, pretend that cancel culture doesn't have negative implications, that it's not harmful. Because it's not just about me not being able to access Twitter. It's not just about one individual losing their job, although that's actually a big deal. Like, I don't think people should act like, oh, they'll be fine. It's like, well, they can't make a living, so no, they probably won't be fine, or they might not be fine. But it's that, like you said, like, it's teaching a lesson. It's telling other people what the bounds of speech are. It's drawing a line. So people see that I'm banned from Twitter for saying men aren't women, for referring to a man as he, so on and so forth, and they're like, oh, I can't say that either. And that's scary.
It's using a small number of instances of crowd-based censoring to create a culture of self-censoring that then leaves a very wrong impression about what people actually believe.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the most scary part of all this is?
Well, I think there are two aspects to it. One, that they will end up taking over a tremendous amount of territory and transferring the opportunity that exists there to their allies. And the second thing is that having done that, the structure will collapse because, for one thing, the opinions that they are hard coding into our belief system aren't accurate, and so you can't actually build anything on the basis of them. But there is also the fact that this coalition is really an alliance of people who are just simply banded together for the purpose of wielding power. And at the point that they actually have power, they will go after each other. And so the real danger is that we will take a structure as important as the United States or the West more generally, and we will end up actually sabotaging it by allowing these wrong-headed perspectives to take over and start steering the ship. They're going to steer it right onto the rocks.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that we can come back from the brink? And if so, how might we do that?
Depends how you define the brink. I think if we are at the brink, then we could come back from here, but it would take courage on a great many people's part. If you're talking about can we come back after we've allowed this to take over all of these institutions and destroy them, probably not. Probably the amount of effort and time it would take is too long, and we just simply don't have it.
That's all from me. Thank you so, so much for your time. It was so great to talk with you. I really appreciate hearing your perspectives on all this.
Yeah, this was great, and really glad to have finally met you and had a chance to interact with you. It's been a lot of fun.